William Wycherley was born in 1641 to an elite family that stayed with the Royalists during the Civil War. And his family actually spent a lot of money supporting the king, and Wycherley himself had a really small inheritance as a result of that. So he was from a royalist family. He was educated in France, which was typical of elite young men in his time. And he returned and he wrote, his first play was called Love in a Wood. And it was, lots of people thought it was really funny. And it kind of got him an entrance into elite court circles. And he had an affair with the Duchess of Cleveland, who was also one of the king's mistresses. And he was, in this circle. And that's when, so he knew the elite circle around Charles II very well. And so that was when he wrote this play, The Gentleman Dancing Master. After this play, he went on to write another play called The Country Wife, and then his final play called The Plain Dealer. He also wrote poetry, but he's mostly known now for these plays, which are considered among the greatest of English comedies. So Charles II had gratitude toward his family because of the way they supported him during the Civil Wars. And so he kind of took Wycherley under his wing and they became friends. And Wycherley at one point, after this play was written, was asked to be the tutor to one of the king's illegitimate sons. So that's the level of respect that the king had for him. One time when Wycherley was sick, the king actually visited him at his house, which is really unusual for a king to come to a commoner's house and visit him. But they actually became really close. He actually, Wycherley later married a countess, but after she died, he didn't end up being able to inherit her money because the inheritance rules were really different at that time. But he didn't inherit her money, and he went to debtor's prison, and he died in poverty. So kind of sad end of his life. But for a while, he was doing well in the court. So Wycherley was a member of the court and close to the king when he wrote this play. And because of that, it's often considered that he's just completely a royalist and completely in favor of the king and supporting all the king's policies. But I think there's actually another way to look at it, which is that if you're close enough to the court, you can kind of get away with saying things that other people can't say. And I think that happened to a lot of the courtiers in the time of Charles II. And one of the most famous ones is the Earl of Rochester, who finally was just so offensive and outrageous that Charles banished him. And so, but for a long time, he was brutally critical of the king. And the king tolerated this to a point. And Wycherley was part of that circle and wrote plays and was a very popular playwright. So, like a lot of the comic writers of his time, he wrote plays that are satiric, and they're often considered like really kind of pushing the envelope at the time, and they offended some people. But he defended his plays in other plays. Like he actually in The Country Wife was actually very offensive to some people. And he has a scene in a later play defending the country wife. So anyway, one thing that Wycherley loves to investigate in great detail are these differences of rank and the way people are jostling for power in his time. And as I've mentioned before, the reason there's so much jostling for power and so much fascination with jostling for power is because a lot of the traditional secure kinds of status markers are no longer persuasive. And so people are kind of fighting for their status in a way that I think maybe they didn't have to before, or that they just accepted more what rank they were in. So, one of the questions this play raises is, does rank make you inherently better, which seems like an interesting question to us, and was definitely a troubling question to them. So he has some national characterizations of national stereotypes in this play. You'll remember that they are allied with the French and greatly in admiration of the Spanish, and both of the countries represented in this play by Don Diego and Monsieur de Paris are allies, or well, they're Catholic countries. That's important to notice, because England was ostensibly Protestant, but the king was suspected of secretly being a Catholic, and his brother James II was out and out Catholic. He was definitely Catholic, and that's partly why he lost the throne in 1688. And the Dutch, who are greatly disparaged in this play, and with whom England was at war when this play was produced, are also a Protestant nation. So it's kind of complicated. You know, in England, some people are more aligned with the Catholics, some people are more aligned with the Protestants. England is technically a Protestant nation, but a lot of the members of the elite were Catholic, possibly including the king. And of course, the king's mother, who I've talked about before, Henrietta Maria, was French and a Catholic. So he had a lot of that influence in his life. So the Spanish are satirized in this play for being particularly patriarchal. You know, Don Diego's like, my daughter can't ever leave the house until she gets married. And so the joke there is that the implication is that English women are more free, and a father would never treat an English woman like that. And he's modeling himself on the Spanish, who he greatly admires. So that's that source of tension that I've mentioned before, that Susan Staves talks about, that English women or consider themselves to be more free than women in other countries. So that's part of the tension. But Don Diego thinks that his daughter will be more virtuous if he acts like a Spaniard, because Spanish women are more virtuous than English women. So that's part of what's a little scandalous, is that this play is kind of an insult from some perspectives to English women. The French, on the other hand, are satirized as being frivolous, as being overconscious of fashion, and sort of I guess you would say these Frenchified characters come across to us as effeminate, and they did to them at the time too. And there's been a lot of discussion about how the relationship between the fop and sexuality. Fops are usually technically heterosexual in plays, but they also have kind of more capacious desire than heterosexuality would allow. And most of the criticism about fops has in fact been about their sexuality. But there's another aspect to the fop here too, is that he's imitating another country. So there's also a question of national identity. So first the play satirizes Spanish restrictive honor. Then it also satirizes French frivolity and overdelicacy, especially male overdelicacy. But the other object of satire is English people who want to be French or want to be Spanish, and who assume that these other nations are better than English nations. So I think I've mentioned all along that in some sort of technical ways, they actually were better, in the sense that they were more wealthy, more powerful, had larger empires, had bigger military forces. So the English were really fascinated by these other empires. And one person who was very fascinated with these empires was the king and his court. And certainly within the court, French was spoken often more than English. And so there was a way in which the court was itself very cosmopolitan, but then part of what this play is doing is holding up those cosmopolitan ambitions for scrutiny. So it's not it's not necessarily saying you should, only be like totally English and true to Englishness, but at the same time, it's saying, maybe there are things about being Spanish that aren't so great. Maybe there are things about being French that aren't so great. And I think the envy itself is being satirized, the envy of these other nations. And then of course, as a comedy, it's structured around roadblocks to the fulfillment of sexual desire, which is standard for comedy, different in every era, but a standard part of comedy. Certainly that's part of a lot of Shakespeare comedies. And so Gerard and Hippolyta want to come together, or I should say Hippolyta wants to figure out a way to get Gerard to be her husband, but she's just under such restriction that she has to be incredibly strategic about it. So that's what the play is about, what the plot is about. So I'll just tell you a few things that are debates and criticism about this play that you can think about as you want to interpret it. So some people would say that Gerard is the ideal because he's the true English gentleman. I think that's possible. I think there are certain things in the play that can undermine that as well. He is definitely lowering himself and becoming a dancing master because that would be beneath him. And so he's also kind of, he's definitely manipulated by Hippolyta, so that might count against him as well. I don't know, depending on what you think about how you interpret Hippolyta, because that's the other, I would say, main sort of point of debate in this play is, of course, Hippolyta is named after the queen of the Amazons. And so is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Are we to admire her cleverness or are we to be scandalized by her forwardness? Because she certainly, manipulates everybody. She's the central manipulator of the play, and she has to communicate to Gerard without ever be able to be in the room with him. So she takes the man she's supposed to marry, Monsieur de Paris, and kind of, plants this idea of playing a trick on him, which allows Gerard to visit her, and then of course they fall in love. So you can think about that, if she's being satirized or if she's admired or if there's some of both in there. So again, I would return to Susan Staves's argument about how women were kind of declaring this was a really big deal, but their right to choose a husband. And that's really what Hippolyta is struggling with. I mean, she's not actually trying to sneak out and have lots of different affairs. She actually is very focused on getting a husband. And so at this time in the elite, most marriages were more or less arranged because the families would come in from the country and they would gather in London, and this would be what they called the marriage market, and the parents would meet, and the young people definitely had some input in this, but in families with property, it was actually kind of considered selfish to marry for your own desire because you weren't thinking about the rest of your family. So it was a very different attitude toward marriage, and that is actually kind of breaking down at this moment. Now, if there wasn't any property involved, this would not be as big a concern, but if there were property involved, it would be kind of a family decision rather than an individual decision of the young people, which is something that's starting to break down in this period. So I think, okay, so just one more thing about Restoration comedy, which is that, and I think I mentioned this before, and this is true of all Restoration theater, but it's like very meta, it's very self-conscious about performance. So there isn't any attempt to build psychological realism or characters with childhoods that were traumatized. It's all about kind of how people are moving around the stage in the moment. And so just one example in this play where you can see this kind of meta theater is that Monsieur and Hippolyta are discussing who's the better fool, Angel or Noakes. And of course, Angel and Noakes were two famous comic actors who were probably in this play. And so playing Don Diego and Monsieur de Paris, who are the two fools in the play, two comic performances. I mean, there's lots of comic performances, but if you want to look at who are like most like clowns or fools, it's those two characters. We get a lot of comedy from watching them. So there's this discussion about these, who is the best fool, and one of the people is the actor to whom they're being referred. So it's an inside joke, but it's also an example of how this theater was always both theater and meta theater. But I do want to note that at one moment, during this discussion, Monsieur de Paris says, "Fools and buffoons have always been most welcome at court and desired in all companies." So I think that's kind of a two-part joke. And one part of it is that kings and courts like fools. Maybe that means that they are fools. And so that there's a kind of satire of the court there. But I think the other part is that comedy writers can get away with stuff that other people can't. And this was really true in the Restoration. And that there are a lot of things that are under the guise of comedy but are political. And I think this is one of those things. This play is one of them, in addition to being funny, but it's also about geopolitics. It's about England's relationship to Spain, to France. It's also about England's ambition to enter the slave trade and whether that can be part of English identity, because in this play it's definitely associated with Spanish identity. So there's a lot to talk about there, and all of these markers of identity. The comedy comes from when they go wrong, when you try to achieve a certain identity and it's revealed in some way as being not performed as well as it could be. So that's part of the joke here. So notice that all of the characters are often shifting in their identity, and they have multiple identities. Like Don Diego is Sir James Formal, and he's Don Diego, but then he's also, at the end, we learn that he was actually, the great grandson of a pin maker. So he's actually from a very humble background, and now he's risen to great power through being a powerful merchant and through his association with the Spanish Empire. And I think it implied, but not really stated outright, in the slave trade. And there are the Blackamoor character who has to teach Monsieur de Paris how to be Spanish. So he is that is a figure who embodies being Spanish, and we don't really have much information about him. He doesn't really say much. He just has a few instructional lines, and there are other African characters in the play too who don't have any lines. And so that is certainly an aspect of this play that might have been topical for the time, for the moment of entering the slave trade.